Hi, I'm Dennis Ward, one of the hosts of APTN National News. We've expanded our Truth in Politics panel into a weekly podcast. Each episode, panelists Jennifer Leywitz and Negon Sinclair join us to examine key issues affecting Indigenous peoples across Canada. Listen and subscribe on your favorite podcast player.
I'm Cierra Bettens. Welcome to APTN News, InFocus. This week, we're putting the Liberal leadership race in focus. They're crisscrossing the country, shaking hands, holding news conferences, and making promises. The 5 candidates who want to take over for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and lead the Liberal Party of Canada say they're up to the challenge. And challenges certainly lay ahead, dealing with US President Donald Trump for starters, and beyond that, the housing shortage and questions about immigration are top of mind. But when it comes to Indigenous issues, including clean water, treaty rights, and challenges in the North, little has been said. So where do candidates stand on reconciliation? Joining me to figure that out is Karyn Pugliese, APTN's Parliament Hill reporter. So Karyn, you wrote that the leadership race is signaling that we're in this post-reconciliation era. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think that if we remember past leadership races, like even with Justin Trudeau, but even going back to Paul Martin, there was a lot of mention of Indigenous people, or some mention of Indigenous people in those leadership debates and in leadership race. This time, there was really just nothing. And so the candidates have really been focused on other things. They're focused on, for the ones who have been quote unquote close to Trudeau, are trying to separate themselves from Trudeau because of his unpopularity. They were focused very much on the election of Trump in the US. The free trade agreement was coming up for renewal in 2026 anyway. But with the Trump suddenly taking that hard line on tariffs, everybody's been focused on how they would react to this tough Trump government coming up in the States. And so even before that, when there was kind of room where they could have launched an Indigenous policy or mentioned Indigenous people, there were no mentions in the launch. There's been very little for Indigenous people knowing where the candidates stand so far in this race. So it does feel a little bit like a post-reconciliation race where reconciliation is just being forgotten about.
So Jaime Batist, a Mi'kmaq member of Parliament and the first Indigenous person to run in the Liberal leadership race, was bringing Indigenous issues to the fore. But then he dropped out. So what does that mean?
Well, what it means is that there's nobody in the race to push that conversation forward. I mean, I think we could have been looking forward to if he'd stayed in the race when they got to the leadership debates. And, the candidates are actually debating each other. There would have been somebody in there to bring up and champion these issues. And now there isn't.
Now that Batist has dropped out, he's announced his backing for Mark Carney. What are some of Carney's Indigenous priorities?
That's a really good question, because Mark Carney didn't name any Indigenous priorities until actually we caught up with him in Halifax. So initially, he had launched his campaign in Edmonton. He had an elder, Irene Morin of the Enoch First Nation, do an opening prayer. And no offense to the elder, but it did feel like a little bit performative, really, because there was the opening prayer by the elder, and then he said nothing for the next 45 minutes of the speech about Indigenous people. So recently, he showed up in Halifax, and it was the day after Jaime Batist had dropped out of the race. And Jaime Batist had been pushing for reconciliation, by which he meant, it's always important to define these things. What do people mean by reconciliation? How are they defining it? He meant closing the gaps on poverty, on water, on housing, all those sort of bread and butter issues where there's a gap between Indigenous people and other Canadians. And so Angel Moore had caught up with Mark Carney at that Halifax event and asked him straight on, like, what are your visions for reconciliation? And the one thing that he kind of pointed out was child welfare, which had been one of the things that Jaime Batist had said needed to change or improve particularly, I think, while Jaime Batist had a lot of nice things to say about the Trudeau government and Trudeau's leadership, really Trudeau's pushing back on child welfare and forcing issues back before the Human Rights Tribunal again was not something that Jaime had enjoyed seeing. So that was one of the things that Mark Carney had picked up, obviously, from Jaime's campaign, that he was going to move forward with. So I mentioned Angel Moore, and Angel Moore catching up with Mark Carney. She also asked him, since he was out on the coast, about Mi'kmaq fishing rights. And she asked him a really precise question. And, well, let's just hear what she asked and how he answered.
Last week, the 13 Nova Scotia chiefs rejected to be part of a $250 million program with the Department of Fisheries. They're saying that our treaties are not for sale, and they are united, and they want to manage their own fishery. And they're frustrated because they say that negotiations should be nation to nation because of the treaties, not with DFO officials. So if you become Prime Minister, would you support the nations of Atlantic Canada, the Mi'kmaq, the Wolastoqey, the Passamaquoddy, managing their own fisheries as the treaties state?
Yeah, several items here, and in part, and in the element of your question, reinforces one aspect. It's not all about DFO, just to be clear, but one aspect of DFO and being closer to the situation on the coast. I was going to say on the ground, but on the coast and in the oceans. That's there. First point. Second point, absolutely, we have a responsibility as government. My government will certainly fulfill our constitutional responsibilities and respect those rights. We want to have a viable fishery that works for First Nations, works for all residents and fishers in Atlantic Canada.
So, Cierra, I don't know, what did you make of that answer?
To me, it sounds pretty defensive right off the bat, and yeah, almost sort of reframing the question. But I'm curious to know what you think as well.
Yeah, I had to check back with Angel. I was like, I don't know, like, do I say this was non-committal? Like, he did say, well, I support treaty rights, but he didn't really answer. Like, her question was very pointed. I think what people would have liked to have heard out of that was, no, we are going to recognize the nation-to-nation relationship. We'll negotiate as a government. We'll take DFO out of the picture. And those are the things that he didn't say, right? So it felt like we decided to go with non-committal because we didn't hear that specific answer.
Mm-hmm. And then right off the bat saying, it's not all about DFO.
I think that Angel maybe caught him off guard, but, it does show that he was down in that region. He had earlier mentioned the fisheries in the context of, commercial fishermen and non-native fishermen. And so you'd think he would have been a little bit more prepared as somebody who's been walking, sort of talking the past few years, like in his past role, as like an economic advisor, about economic reconciliation. It kind of felt like he should know something about that region. If he's going to mention fisheries, expect the question about, Indigenous rights.
I'm also curious, just with the style of answering the question, has it been typical of, Liberal leadership and Justin Trudeau to sort of frame answers to questions in this way?
Yeah, it feels like there's that, broad support question, like where they just say, well, of course we support treaty rights. Of course we do. But then they never really define what that means or what they're going to do. And I think that's where, it's our job as reporters to try to nail them. Now, I've got to say that we have asked Mark Carney for a sit-down interview. We're on his list. And they said that they'll get to us when he has time. I like to joke around and say, we'll do it alphabetically. APTN comes first, But they have promised to get back to us. In that particular scrum, like, this is a very managed setting. And so each reporter got one question and one follow-up. So Angel had the one question about reconciliation, the one question about the fisheries, and wasn't in a position where she could push back and say, what do you mean by that? So it makes it tricky to interview them.
Mm-hmm. And so moving on to another candidate, we have another front-runner, Christia Freeland, who is arguably the most high-profile type candidate, we could say. And that's for a few reasons. So first, she's held a number of high-level posts as the Minister of International Trade, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Finance, and also Deputy Finance Minister. But she's also high profile because it really was her resignation that arguably led to Trudeau's fall. Can you remind us of what happened?
Yeah, what happened was, I guess, behind the scenes, she and Trudeau were having disagreements about how finances should be managed. Trudeau, according to Christia Freeland, wanted to kind of do some, some warm, fuzzy policies that are just kind of like popular. And she felt like they needed to get very, very serious against what was happening in the US and particularly against Trump. And they ended up disagreeing. He told her behind the scenes that he was going to demote her from the position of finance minister. And in the end, she decided that she was just going to resign. And she went public with a resignation letter. And I think that, that was really a key moment for the Trudeau government. He was already suffering from issues where he wasn't very popular, where people were asking him to resign. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back.
Mm-hmm. And from there, what do we know about Freeland's record on Indigenous issues?
Well, she's held quite a lot of international, foreign affairs kind of roles. And so she hasn't had a chance to really interact directly with Indigenous peoples a lot, except for in her most recent role as finance minister. But it's always kind of hard to tell, because the policy that's rolling out was rolled out in mandate letters. And so she had to kind of make those mandate letters work. So what ideas are hers and what ideas are Trudeau's? I did get a chance to speak to people on her team and just ask if there was anything that they wanted to highlight. We are looking for a sit-down interview with Christia Freeland as well, of course. And so they sent over a note and said, just reminding us of the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program. And that's a program that makes it easier for particularly First Nations to borrow money off of banks so that they can invest in natural resource projects. Hard for First Nations to borrow because they don't have collateral. They don't have something that the bank can seize. Like they would for non-Native people, where they could seize your house or your building, like if you fell through on a loan. So this means that the government guarantees the loan, banks can lend money, and First Nations can do development. So that was one of the things that she wanted to highlight, which means both she and Mark Carney are really talking about reconciliation very much in an economic development kind of lens. And so they're kind of similar in that way.
Right. And so next we have Karina Gould. So she entered politics back in 2015 at 27 years old. And then 10 years later, she's served as Minister of Families, Children and Social Development, as Minister of International Development, and Minister of Democratic Institutions. And the Mohawk Territory of Six Nations is also in her riding. So what is she promising?
So Karina Gould actually is one of the candidates who did take us up, and I think has been on the show more than once now, answering our questions. And she said that one of the things that was key for her was keeping financial investments going out to Indigenous people and Indigenous communities. We're probably going to see, an era of restraint coming up. But she said that if she was chosen as Liberal leader, she would keep investments flowing at the level that they are, not cap them, not pull them back. The other thing she talked about, reconciliation, and to her, that was remembering the harm of colonialism and not going back there. She pointed out that both of her grandparents were Holocaust survivors. And so when she's out doing things like touring the Mohawk Institute, the former residential school on Six Nations close to her riding, it reminds her of her own family history and the importance of recognizing the damage that colonialism can do. And then the other thing that she talked about was creating a lot of opportunities for children and youth. And there's a clip that I have from that interview.
I think there's huge opportunities for Indigenous youth to be trained to take care of their communities, right? Like, we have a lot of people who are wonderful who fly into communities as nurses, as doctors, as dentists, etc. But wouldn't it be great if more of the people who were doing that were actually from the community and Indigenous themselves? And maybe, their local community isn't enough to make a living from, but maybe, it would be great if there were more Indigenous people who took on those roles, who could take care of their communities as well. So I think there's a huge amount of opportunity, but we have to be really mindful and specific and dedicated about making it happen.
And so, I'm curious, after having that conversation with Carina Gould, what are your feelings about her potential to, deliver on these commitments to reconciliation?
Yeah, her platform, and this is what we kind of expect at this point, is not really well developed. It's just like priority areas. And so when she was working as Minister of Families, Children and Social Development, she had rolled out a program, the Indigenous Early Learning and Childcare Initiative. And one of the things about that is that there was a lot of thought that went into it to create a framework, by which we mean that she talked to Inuit leaders, she talked to Métis leaders, she talked to First Nations leaders. And the program rolled out a little bit differently for each a group of peoples, because they had different priorities. So her approach was one that leadership tends to like. So she has that kind of experience, even if at this point her priority areas are not really developed in depth. And she did talk a lot about needing to consult with First Nations, Métis and Inuit people before she could roll out something more substantial.
Mm-hmm. And so beyond that, there are also two candidates that we're not really hearing much about. They are Ruby Dalla and Frank Baylis. Can you tell us, who are they and why aren't we really hearing much about them?
Yeah, well, they're kind of the outsider candidates. I don't think now, of course, anything can happen. Back in 2006, Stéphane Dion was not considered a favorite for leadership, and he ended up leapfrogging ahead of both Bob Rae and Michael Ignatieff. And everybody thought Michael Ignatieff was going to win. So I always say never. But right now, there are two people who are considered sort of outsiders and not likely to take the race, although they could become important as kingmakers or queenmakers by throwing their support, if they have enough of it, behind one candidate or the other. So that's why we kind of want to watch them. Frank Baylis is a former MP. He left politics in 2019, and he's now a Montreal businessman. He's executive chairman of the board of directors of Baylis Medical Technologies, and that's a firm that was actually started by his mom and sold for $1.7 billion to a U.S. company, and it makes medical equipment. And then Ruby Dalla is a former Ontario MP. She left politics 9 years ago. And, I think that we'll find out more about their reasons to run as we get further in the race.
So going back to this idea of this post-reconciliation era, and, as we navigate what these candidates are saying, how do we sort of distinguish optics and these almost performances of reconciliation from real commitment and, real action?
Yeah, I think that the devil's going to be in the details. I think as we hear more, we need to hear some really well thought out plans, and we need to see them actually interacting with Indigenous peoples. I haven't seen them anywhere on their spots now as they're going through and they're doing these what we call stump speeches, and they're rolling out a little bit of policy here and there. We're not seeing them stop in Indigenous communities. We're not seeing them court Indigenous votes. And, it's always a big sign to me when, APTN reaches out and says, I'll give you 15 minutes, tell me your 3 priority areas, when leaders can't find 15 minutes. It's not a lot of time. And we have seen them sitting down and doing interviews with other media. There's been interviews with CBC, there's been interviews with the Toronto Star, and so we're waiting for our 15 minutes. And, it's not a personal thing. It doesn't have to be APTN, but I'd love to see them sit down with any Indigenous media, because to me, sitting down with Indigenous media who are going to ask you to explain yourself and unpack like a real vision for how you're going to work with our nations. That's, to me, where the rubber hits the road, and where you start to see something that's less performative and see them taking it seriously.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us, Karyn.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Karyn Pugliese is APTN's Parliament Hill reporter, and you can follow her work at aptnnews.ca. This episode of APTN InFocus was produced by Mark Blackburn and Charmaine Straker. InFocus is edited by Jesse Andrushko and hosted by me, Cierra Bettens. InFocus is available wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Kathleen Martins, a reporter with APTN News. Homeless, houseless, shelterless people. They aren't hard to find in Winnipeg. They're on the sidewalks, in bus shelters, and down alleyways. But who are they? Hear their stories in my podcast called Our Relatives. Listen on your favorite player.